Here again we have Moses' burning bush. This is exactly what Moses witnessed some 3,600 years ago on Mount Horeb. This is the bush that burns and yet does not burn. This is Moses' burning bush. This is exactly what he was witnessing some 3,600 years ago on Mount Horeb. This is the bush that burns and yet does not burn. This is one of the most astronomically rare phenomena in all of nature. This only occurs roughly about every 30,000 years or so. There's a reason why in all of human history you've only ever heard of one person encountering this one time. So the fact that Moses even witnessed this at all is itself a miracle. These events only occur if there is a nearly apocalyptic level of seismic activity going on beneath a particular area. And that only happens roughly, tens of thousands of years apart, and it happens at random. So there's no way to predict it or, guess where it is. You just have to have sensors available. If you have millions of dollars of sensors at your disposal and rapid response aerial transportation, but the probability of someone just stumbling upon one of these on accident is essentially zero. And this occurs because the Earth itself is, when you have that huge amount of turmoil inside it, you have tectonic plates grinding against one another, and this is causing a huge dispersal of electric charge, like static charge, rising up to the surface of the Earth. It's kind of like when you walk across the carpet with your slippers on a dry day, and that static charge builds up in your body. And if it builds up intense enough, like it can even make your hair stand up, sort of like touching a giant Van de Graaff generator or something. Well, the Earth can do that exact same thing. And when it does, you get this charge that wants to get up as high as it possibly can and escape the Earth. So it's basically looking for mountains, trees, bushes, anywhere where it can get really high. And then wherever it finds the highest instance of something with very sharp corners or edges or points or needles on it, it'll come bursting out of those points, and you'll get this corona plasma erupting forth from those sharp points. And that's because the static charge is the least stable at those very sharp angles. And so that's why the Torah was so adamant that Moses' burning bush was specifically a thorn bush. It was those very sharp thorn bush needles that were so perfect for allowing that electrical plasma to burn off and erupt out of it. So this was essentially Moses' corona of thorns. And if you get too close to one of these burning bushes, then you'll get the Thor experience from the thorn bush, because a massive bolt of lightning will reach out and touch you. So you have to be electrically grounded to the earth so that you're at the same potential as the bush, so that it doesn't want to touch you. The field of the bush will actually sense your field, or sense that you're this giant neutral reservoir of aqueous solution, and it'll essentially arc out and fill you up. And then that can kill you as dead as a hammer. So it's very important that in the 1 in a quadrillion chance that you stumbled upon one of these in nature, that you not get too close to it without, taking your shoes off or somehow becoming an electrical connection with the earth. The thorn bush is able to, oh no, if Moses were to try and get close to this, which he likely would have out of just absolute fascination, it would have been important that he take his sandals off, and so he wouldn't be insulated, and that would enable the charge inside the earth to come up into his body much more gently through just his feet, through that very small surface area of his feet. Uh, and it wouldn't be as dramatic coming into his body as it would the bush, because the bush has all these, roots going out into the earth. And so it has a huge amount of surface area to conduct that charge. And then it has these super sharp thorns on it that are able to, emit the charge out, much more effectively. So it would have been very important that he take his sandals off, but there would have been no way that he would have known that. He just simply would not have had the time to figure that out through trial and error. Like testing what happens if I get close to it, with my cloak in front of my arm, or I put my staff out towards it, or, he just would not have been able to do that, because if he had gotten too close the first time with his sandals on, it would have blasted him. That could have easily killed him. That type of lightning blast in the industry kills people all the time, unfortunately. And so, but if by some miracle he somehow survived the blast, and then by some even greater miracle he was insane enough to try and come back and get close to the bush again, which he would not have done, he would not have been able to get another test out of it, because his body would have been brought up to charge by the bush. He would not have been able to get it to blast him a second time. If he did want to do a test, which he likely would not have, what he would have needed to have done would be to go away, have lunch for a while at a distance from the bush, and just watch it, and give his body time to dissipate that charge, and then go back and try something else. But that would have taken a lot of time, and he did not have that much time to do that, because these events don't last for super long. They can kind of come on and go off and come back on and kind of ebb and flow a little, but generally speaking, it's not going to last a super huge amount of time. And if it comes back, you're lucky. So the bottom line, it was impossible that he could have known about that safety hazard, that he needed to take his sandals off. And yet the story specifically says in the Torah that the bush told him to take his sandals off. And so that in itself is quite anomalous, that the story tells him to do that, or it says that the bush told him to do that. Because if you want to imagine he was just hallucinating, then that is the luckiest hallucination ever, because that was the one thing that saved his life. So the bush tells him to take his sandals off. He does approach it. Doesn't tell him about safety hazards. It just tells him the ground on which you are standing is holy. So the story kind of veils and encrypts that little detail for the future, whether you want to ascribe intent or not. I'm trying to speak in neutral terms so no one in the scientific fields need be offended. I'm a scientist myself, of many backgrounds for decades. So I'm trying to speak in as neutral terms as possible, but it is quite amazing that all of these coincidences happen. One, that he encountered this thing at all, and two, that somehow he perceived that the bush told him to take his sandals off. And that's actually how the entire Exodus is. The entire Exodus was happening due to seismic activity, from the plagues of Egypt to the splitting of the sea, to the events at Mount Sinai, to the manna which sustained them in the desert for 40 years, crossing the Jordan at the end of the 40 years, and battling Jericho and the Amorites and all of this stuff. Every single part of that was occurring via seismic activity on a scale that is almost Armageddon, that this world rarely sees, relative to our human timescale. So the entire Exodus was occurring through seismic activity, but encrypted into all of it was a number of impossible coincidences. And the story is real, by the way. The entire thing, as they described it in the Torah, is, we now know, is actually shockingly accurate. It's we only realize this now through some fairly advanced science, but the entire thing did occur. It did occur how they said it occurred, and they described it with the precision of a surgeon. It's kind of amazing. And so now the Exodus is science. And I'll explain later why no one has ever quite figured this out yet. It has a lot to do with needing to unite different areas of philosophy, you could say. There's a reason I'm covering this and not someone who's an actual filmmaker or documentarian. I'm just a lab guy, like a field researcher and all these things. But no one wants to touch this subject because academia doesn't tend to like anything that proves religious narratives correct, and the world of religion doesn't like anything that explains away their miracles with science. And that's where it was hiding the whole time, is in that nexus, that merger of philosophies, because you needed to have the humility to consider the other side in order to see that it was all happening through science, like scientific phenomena, but encrypted within it were these coincidences, like I said, that are just astronomical in scale. And not one, not two, not three, but we're talking like dozens and dozens and dozens for decades and decades and decades, over and over and over, happening to these people. And so that's kind of your clue that, maybe there's a little more going on than just random chance. So that's where it all comes together. And it was all one people, by the way. It was not just a bunch of separate stories being cobbled together by some later chronicler. It was one story of one people, continuous from start to finish. The only other culture that witnessed and recorded a significant portion of it was the Ipuwer papyrus in Egypt, because they experienced the plagues right alongside the Hebrews. The Egyptians experienced the plagues, but somehow the plagues miraculously dodged hitting the Hebrews, and but the Egyptians saw the plagues, and that has been recorded, as I said, in the Ipuwer papyrus. And people have just assumed it was a coincidence and come up with other sort of creative explanations for why the Ipuwer papyrus is describing the exact same plagues that the Torah does, and they've assumed that because the Ipuwer papyrus dates to a couple centuries earlier, before when the Exodus happened. If you date the Exodus by the later parts of the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, if you use the Tanakh after the Torah, those later books, to date the Exodus, you get a date of roughly negative 1300 years before Rome, or 3,300 years ago. But if you try to use the Torah to date all of these things in and of itself, it doesn't date itself. You only get the dates from the Tanakh, but there's a principle that the Torah trumps everything else. The Torah trumps Tanakh. So when in doubt, if there's a conflict, you go with the Torah. But no one has really done that. So that's where it was hiding. But if you go with the Torah perfectly aligns with massive seismic activity that was occurring 3,600 years ago. So if you use the Torah to date when the Torah happened, you have to do it through science. All right, we lost the light and we lost our fire, but hopefully you can still see the bush. We left off talking about how the entire Exodus was carried out through seismic activity. And so um, I guess we'll just start with the plagues of Egypt. There have been some researchers who have already noticed that the plagues of Egypt can be explained with seismic activity, but no one has ever noticed that the whole entire rest of the Exodus can be explained with seismic activity too. Because, the other phenomena are a little more exotic than the plagues of Egypt. The plagues of Egypt are actually pretty straightforward as far as the how they're caused by seismic activity. And like I said, other researchers have already pointed most of this out, what I'm about to tell you about the plagues, but I'll just fill in the blanks a little bit and clarify some points. So it starts with the first plague, and the plagues start because, according to the story, the bush tells Moses that he needs to go back to Egypt to free his people. And because his people are enslaved there, if you don't know the story. And so he goes back to Egypt. But the story says that the bush also gives him like a strategy of what to do. And he's supposed to tell Pharaoh, or to ask Pharaoh, if he can let his people go for several days, 3 days, so that they can go out into the desert and worship their God. And then they can come back, and then that will prevent their God from bringing plagues upon Egypt. So Moses goes to Pharaoh, asks him exactly that, like the bush told him to do. And Pharaoh, of course, says no. He's not going to just like give them a paid vacation. So then the plagues start, and the first one is that the river turns to blood, the Nile River. It turns completely red, and it's already been noticed that this is the result of a phenomenon known as limnic eruptions. This is when, in this case, in the Nile, what happened was a huge amount of gas from inside the earth came rushing up through fissures and cracks through the strata and pouring into the Nile River all at once, fairly far upstream from where Egypt was. And when that gas, like CO2 and stuff from inside the earth, comes up into a body of water like that, and there you have the right type of sediment like you do in that region and many others, the gas actually chemically reacts with some of that sediment and some of the iron compounds in it, and then produces like iron oxides and these iron compounds, which turn red. It's essentially rust. And so then the entire body of water turns stark red. And you can go look at images of it. And so once the water becomes like this, it becomes extremely stifling for everything that's in it. And anything that's in it that cannot get out of it will die, will essentially suffocate. And then anything that's in it that can get out of it will get out of it. So the crocodiles and the frogs will come pouring out. And then the frogs especially will need a new source of water. So they'll go flooding into the land looking for another source of water somewhere. But they were flooding into all those really nice riverfront properties along the entire Egyptian district where the Egyptians lived. And so then they had that plague of frogs. And then they couldn't find more water, of course, so they just dehydrated and died. And then you had the plague of maggots, or lice, as they said, but it was we would say maggots. And then you have the plague of flies, of course, which follows that. Then the flies go around, they land on all sorts of stuff. They land on gross stuff, then they land on you, on your face, on your food. They land on people with diseases and then other people. And so it's kind of like fleas spreading the bubonic plague, the flies go around and just spread a bunch of disease and stuff. So then that caused the next plague, which was the plague of pestilence that killed most of their livestock, which probably was actually a death of mercy to spare them from what was to come soon after. But so that was the pestilence plague, and then you had the plague of boils in the people, where their skin started, breaking out in boils and such. And a lot of people have tried to like overthink this one and come up with really exotic explanations for how they would have gotten boils, but it really doesn't need to be any more complicated than just flies were spreading disease all around and something nasty got on everybody and they all broke out with boils. So that's your first 6 plagues. They were, very disturbing to the Egyptians, but as Moses is communicating with Pharaoh after each plague and, telling him what's going to come next and asking him again if his people can go out to the desert, Pharaoh's constantly saying no. And up till this point, he still was very staunch in that stance and still not willing to let them go or anything, because Pharaoh himself had sorcerers and they could do all sorts of wild stuff. And so in those first 6 plagues, after the river turning to blood, they all make sense. It follows in a natural order. And so as far as the magical component of it all, Pharaoh was not that amazed by that. And so, of course, he still says no to Moses. And so then you had the 7th plague, which was a whole different animal. The Torah says that hailstones started raining down on the districts of Egypt with fire inside of them. And researchers have pointed out that if you have a volcanic eruption and it goes up high enough and it spreads its ash and dust up high enough, then once that goes up into the cloud layer, what happens is it acts as an impurity that water molecules can stick to. So this is basically how rain and hail is formed anyway. It's like little micro invisible impurities in the air, but a volcano would provide a very large amount of these little impurities for those water molecules to glom onto. And then that could produce hail. And then if you had hail falling down at the same time that you had volcanic fallout coming down like lava and stuff, then they've pointed out that you could explain that plague in that manner with the volcanic lapilli. But that's not what the story says. It doesn't say that hailstones were falling down and then fire was falling down with them. They said hailstones were falling down and there was fire in them. And when they said that, they meant it. So this is what actually happened. When that massive volcano, Santorini, went off, it blasted an enormous amount of lava and magma just way up into the troposphere, up into the higher layers and the cloud layers and stuff. And it did it so much and so fast that those lava globules that go rocketing through the air, they actually cool down really quickly because they're flying so fast, or the skin of it cools down because it happens so fast. So the skin of it cools down and hardens and solidifies, and then you basically have this hard, solid rock on the outside that still has molten hot lava on the inside because it just happened so fast. And so it's rocketing through the upper troposphere. It acts as a giant condensation nuclei for water to glom onto, and then it just starts building up this massive ice layer around it. So you literally end up with hailstones falling from heaven that have fire inside of them. And then these come smashing down on Egypt, and the ice crushes and breaks out everywhere, and then the lava bomb in the center, which is the technical term, it comes smashing into the ground as well and breaks out, and then you get like molten lava spraying out with ice at the same time, and then the lava starts lighting stuff on fire. And so, like I said, when they said hailstones of ice were falling with fire inside, they meant hailstones of ice were falling with fire inside. And they even said they were very heavy, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. And that's because granite basalt is 3 times denser than ice. So that's why they said they were so heavy. And, you know, they would have felt it like smashing down on the roofs of their houses and stuff. But anyway, so that was the 7th plague of Egypt, and that really rattled Pharaoh's cage, and that freaked him out because his sorcerers had some pretty cool tricks, but they didn't have that trick. That was a whole new phenomenon for him and all of them. So they were really starting to get unnerved at this point. And this is a very important point in the plagues, because at this point, Moses says to Pharaoh, okay, obviously you can see we're dealing with a very serious God, and the next plague that's going to come is going to be locusts, and they're going to eat up like what little remaining food you do have out there that hasn't been destroyed or, you know, burnt up or something. And so now they're really starting to freak out, you know, just how unnerved they are about the 7th plague, and then this threat of, you know, losing the rest of their crops in the field and stuff. And so Moses basically ups his ante at this point. Originally he was asking for 3 days, and now he changes it and says it's no longer 3 days. Now he says we don't know how long it could take. Like, we're obviously dealing with a very serious God here, so we're gonna need to do a very good job appeasing him, and we don't know how long that could take. So we're gonna need all of our people to go, you know, to make really sure we make him happy. And since we don't know how long it's gonna be, we're gonna need to bring our livestock. So this is actually a very important little detail here, because he's upping his original bid. You know, this is like negotiation. You open with one thing, and then you kind of work your way down closer to what you really wanted. Well, he opened low and was, you know, ratcheting it up. And that's a very critical detail. I don't think I've never heard of anyone pointing that out. Maybe some rabbis have noticed. None that I've ever heard of. But that's a critical detail, because now it's not 3 days. Now he's probably thinking something more along the lines of 7 days. Because if you go from 3 to like, well, we don't know, like you're not talking like 1 or 2 more days. You're talking like a few more days. And so Pharaoh's probably thinking about maybe 7 days at this point. And that's a critical number to keep in mind. So that's the 7th plague. And then Pharaoh still says no anyway. And so the 8th plague comes, as he said. The locusts come. They get blown in from the east, and then by the wind, and then they do end up eating most of what is left in the fields. And then they get blown directly back to the east into the Yam Suf. And the Yam Suf is a body of water, and it's directly, the 8th plague of Egypt tells us that it's directly to the east of the Egyptian districts, which tells us that when they say Yam Suf, they meant what we would call the Red Sea. So Yam Suf, Red Sea. And that's a critical little detail, because there's been a lot of debate over whether or not when they said Yam Suf, they were really talking about the Red Sea, because people have been trying to find where they crossed through the Red Sea. And so it's been this big debate, like, does Yam Suf really mean that, or does it mean something else? Well, the 8th plague of Egypt is one of the many places throughout the Tanakh where it does in fact tell you, it does triangulate what they're talking about. And yes, we have translated it correctly. They are talking about the Red Sea, not lakes in the Nile's northern delta region or something like that. So that's why the 8th plague is interesting. And then you had the 9th plague, where total darkness came over the lands of Egypt for 3 days and cast it into just total blackness. But as researchers have already noticed, this plague was again caused by the Santorini eruption. What you had was, it was just the volcanic ash cloud that was produced by the eruption had just finally caught up to them and drifted over the lands of Egypt. And then you get total darkness. And once again, they got the sequence exactly correct. You had the lava bombs first in the 7th plague, and then maybe a week, a fortnight later, you get the volcanic ash cloud catching up and going over the land. So that was the first 9 plagues. Then the 10th plague and the final plague, it's terrible to talk about, but it says that the firstborn of the children and their pets all died. And it's already terrible to lose a child. It's the worst pain anyone could ever face. But then, adding on to that, also losing, their puppies and kittens too, is just adds insult to injury. But and they definitely loved their pets, because like if you got caught, I think everyone knows by now that Egyptians really loved their cats especially. And like if you got caught hurting a cat in Egypt, they would just drag you out into the street and beat you to death in front of everybody. So like they did not mess around when it came to protecting their fuzzy critters. So, having the puppies and kittens die too would just, adds so much to that. And, that plague is what finally just broke their spirit completely. And but other researchers have noticed that this too is an effect of the phenomenon of limnic eruptions that we talked about for the first plague, where you have these gases from inside the earth coming up into a body of water. And but here's the thing: if you're too close to a limnic eruption, that gas that comes up and intermixes with the water, it also explodes out of the water like a gigantic fountain way up into the sky. Well, not too far, but it up like a skyscraper into the sky. And then, but it's cold because it had to go through that water. So then this huge, cloud of mist just comes crushing back down into the earth, and then it goes out in the path of least resistance, and in a river that's downstream. So, and if you get caught in that mist as it passes over you, it basically just suffocates you to death. And so you had this mist pouring down the Nile, sort of hanging low and lingering closer down to the water. And as it got, so this was a later limnic eruption that was further downstream, and that's why the mist was still present when it got to Egypt this time. And according to the researcher Simcha Jacobovici, he says the eldest children of Egypt got the privilege of having their own bed, and it was like a low bed down closer to the floor, and the other children tended to sleep on things like the roof, which was perfectly normal throughout ancient times in hot climates. They would just put like a thatched reed canopy overhead for shade, and then they would do everything up there. They would cook, they would sew and make stuff, they would sleep up there. So that was a common thing. And but if you have a scenario like that where you have your firstborn sleeping inside in the houses on a bed that's lower down to the ground, and then you have the other children up on the roof, then that would explain why this mist that passed over was much more concentrated over the firstborn of Egypt, and why you had a much higher concentration of the eldest being taken by this. But so there's your 10th horrifying plague. And then this just totally breaks them, like they Pharaoh gives in at this point, and he agrees to let Moses go out into the desert to worship his God, and take all his people and all their livestock and stuff. And there's an interesting point here, because he tells Moses to tell his God to bless him. He says, tell your God to bless me, which is kind of like a threat, almost. Like, if bad things keep happening to me, then either you didn't tell him to bless me, or he just won't bless me. Either way, it's kind of like a wink, wink, like, tell your God to bless me. And but implicit in that, like doubly implicit in that implied, pseudo threat, is the fact that they were expecting them to come back to Egypt. It wasn't like in the movies. Like, I've noticed all the movies and Western civilization and pop culture has gotten this detail wrong, where they show it like Moses trying to tell Pharaoh to just let his people go forever, go to freedom, and then Pharaoh finally giving in and being like, fine, go back to the land of Canaan. I hope you like it. But that's not at all what was happening. It was basically a shell game, a little, sleight of hand, where Moses was going to tell him, we just want a few days, but then they were going to make a run for it, basically. And a lot of people don't really like that assertion that it was an act of essentially deception, strategic deception, but that's literally what it was. And it wasn't just deception for the sake of deception. It was deception because it was absolutely necessary, because you don't go to a pharaoh and say, let my slaves go, and give away a huge portion of your economy. The pharaoh was treated as a living god, and you don't say that to a living god, like, you need to just freely give away a massive portion of your economy. They're not going to agree to that. And no matter what he thought about himself as pharaoh, he still knew that he needed to maintain his reputation as like the big man, and he couldn't allow his reputation to be damaged by something that absurd. And so he was willing to. He would rather have died than to have given up the slave population like that. And that's literally what he did. I mean, he took it all the way to the end, and that's what rulers did in the old days. Like, they had a reputation to maintain, and they would do everything to the point of death to keep that. They would ride into battle in the very front, in the most dangerous locations, because they needed to maintain that reputation of power. And so this idea that you would tell someone like that, oh yeah, just give up this gigantic portion of your economy for free, no, he would have never, under any circumstance, agreed to something like that. So it was absolutely necessary that Moses used, this little strategy of just kind of like telling him, oh, it's just going to be for a few days, but really, they were going to make a run for it. And what's interesting too is the Hebrew people knew this as well, because he came to Pharaoh and told him, we want to go for 3 days, but then to the Hebrews he said, no, we're going forever. It's not just 3 days. We're leaving. And the Hebrew people knew, I mean, everybody knew, this was just like common sense in the old days, like breathing, that you don't run away from the world's most powerful ancient military that is completely on horseback and chariots. Like, you don't get away from that, especially as a massive group of people. And so this idea that Moses was pitching to them of like, no, we're going forever, they were like, get out of here, get lost. And they saw him as an Egyptian anyway, because he grew up as an Egyptian, an adopted Egyptian. There's a whole backstory for those who aren't familiar, but he grew up being raised. He was adopted because of a sort of a switcheroo, a misunderstanding. Anyway, he was adopted by an Egyptian princess who couldn't have her own kids, and so he was raised as a prince of Egypt. And so he talked and thought like they did, and so the Hebrew people kind of saw him like that. And then when Mr. Fancy shows up and he's telling them, oh yeah, we're gonna run away forever, they were like, get out of here, go away, get lost. So so the plagues of Egypt weren't just to break the resolve of the Egyptians, it was to give it to the Hebrews, to give them faith that they could actually get away. And at this point, they were actually starting to have hope, like, oh wow, this seems real, like this is really happening, like we might actually be getting away right now into freedom. I mean, they were still reluctant, but like they had hope finally that maybe this could be real. And in their minds, it was like, well, worst case scenario, we get a 7-day paid vacation in the desert to party and have their own Burning Man. And they were told to ask their hosts, their Egyptian hosts, like anyone who was a servant in an Egyptian house, they were told to ask their hosts if they could borrow some gold and jewelry and like fine garments to take out into the desert to do like a really good job impressing their God. And the hosts agreed because, their spirit was broken and they didn't care. They're just like, whatever, just please take it, make your God happy. But this is another interesting point because they would have never given them all of that wealth. It says that they walked out of there with all the wealth of Egypt. They would have never given them all the wealth of Egypt if they thought that they were never coming back. That's another tell that the Egyptians thought, like, no, this is just a temporary thing. But in the hearts of the Hebrews, like, there was starting to be this hope that, oh no, we might actually be getting away. And then when they saw all the wealth of Egypt pouring into their own hands, like, you've seen people when they win the lottery and they just like, they get extremely elated. Well, there was this hope building that like, oh wow, not only might we be about to get away, but we might just have won the lottery in the process if we can move our feet fast enough. So like they were getting like really excited and they had so they had emotional energy on their side. They had physical strength on their side because they were used to working these really brutal, like 12+ hour days of hard labor as slaves. And they also had metabolic energy because they were told to fill up on calories, like slow release forms of calories that would sustain them for a long, intense journey. And one of those was a lot of bread, and they were supposed to make unleavened bread, which just makes it like a cracker. And so whenever it's like a cracker, the storage life is a lot better. So it's really good for traveling. And but ancient bread too, it wasn't like this horrifying Frankenstein bread that they've turned our modern bread into with like the genetic mutations of the 50s, breeding semi-dwarf strains and these like bizarre ways they process it. Ancient breads is like going from like, Victorian, colonial, medieval, ancient times all the way back was real bread the way it's actually originally was created. And it's what we might now call heritage bread, and it didn't spike your blood sugar. It gave you sustained energy all day long, like a slow release, like trickle of carbohydrates coming out, and it had a lot more protein in it, and that gives you also more slow release calories throughout the day because your liver can convert the proteins into more carbohydrates. And so And people nowadays pay big money, like a pretty penny, to get really fancy supplements that do exactly that. Give them that slow release of carbohydrate energy throughout the day. But we already had that supplement. It was just called bread. And they were full of it. And so they had just a ton of energy to sustain them over a long trip. And they had everything on their side at that point. And it says that they were brought out of Egypt on the wings of eagles, which is to say, like, very quickly. Not literally on wings of eagles, but very quickly. And that's why it was so quick, because they were strong. They had all that metabolic energy, and their hope was just skyrocketing that they might be about to win the lottery. Oh, and freedom, but the lottery especially. So they were getting really excited. And they just, they got out of there when the time was right. And they had about a 7-day lead, as I mentioned. And so it was about 7 days before the Egyptian scouts that were following them were starting to get suspicious, because, they were probably told something to the effect of, well, they need to be back in 7 days, or they're supposed to be. But after 7 days, the scouts would have noticed that they weren't even slowing down. Like, they hadn't stopped. They hadn't thrown a party to worship their God. They hadn't done any of that. They were just flying as fast as possible. And so this is when they would have, finally just gotten way too leery and just gone back to Egypt and reported what was happening. And then they would have mounted a response, put a bunch of supplies in saddlebags and chariots, and then gone after them. And if you have a 7-day lead, don't worry about the math if it bothers you, but if you have a 7-day lead and you can walk 20 miles a day, and then the scouts have to go all the way back that whole entire distance on their horses, and they can go about 50 miles a day, like a Pony Express rider. And then the Egyptians have to mount a response and then catch up with them, and they can go about 40 miles a day, kind of like a stagecoach. And then you put that all together, and you get, starting from that original 7-day lead, you get 11 days before the Egyptians would have finally caught up to them. And when an average group of people with women and children and elderly and oxen and such can go, kind of like Conestoga wagons and stuff, can go about 20 miles a day. But the Hebrews were not an average group of people. As we talked about, they were supercharged for flight. And so they could have easily done 20 miles an hour a day. 20 miles a day. No sweat. Probably more, but they could have easily done that. And so that would have, at 11 days, that places them about 220 miles away from Egypt, which is a really long way. And that might seem like a long way to walk for most people, but I used to do cross-country running and ultra marathons and stuff. And in the ancient times, people did that stuff too. They were constantly walking. That's what you did. And so walking that distance for someone who does that on a regular basis is child's play. That's nothing. But it takes a little while, but it's not that big a deal. But so that 220 mile figure is going to be very important soon, and we're going to have to come back to it, because now we have to talk about first, before that, some of the other researchers might question what I'm saying, because they don't record a whole bunch of campsites between leaving Egypt and getting to the Red Sea crossing. They make it almost sound like it was just 1 or 2 days, because it's just we camped here in Egypt, and then we camped here by the Red Sea. So it kind of makes it sound like it was really quick. So that makes people look very close to Egypt. But here's the thing. When you're flying on the wings of eagles, you don't care about every little podunk rest stop you're stopping at, or any town. That's not your concern. You're trying to move your feet. It's irrelevant. And plus, if you give 2 points and they fall in a straight line, then that tells everyone in the future where you went. You don't have to mention if it's a straight line that you went on, you don't have to mention every single little point along the way. You could just say we camped here in Egypt, and then we left, and then we camped here. And then that just tells everyone in, the old days who knows the cities that we're talking about, oh, so you went that way. So they weren't trying to say it was only a day away. They were just trying to say it was in a straight line, and from here to here, 220 miles. And we'll talk about where that is. But now we have to talk about the debate over where the crossing of the Red Sea was.